June 1944, Central Pacific Theater. The war had reached a critical juncture where the pace of American military operations had accelerated beyond what military planners and logistical specialists had anticipated even in their most optimistic assessments of how rapidly the American industrial machine could project power across the vast distances of the Pacific Ocean. And the fundamental problem that confronted American military commanders was not the presence of enemy forces or the availability of weaponry or the courage and determination of American soldiers and sailors, but rather something far more prosaic and seemingly mundane yet absolutely critical to the success of military operations, which was the simple matter of where aircraft could land after flying across thousands of miles of open ocean to strike at Japanese positions, and where damaged aircraft could be repaired, and where supplies and ammunition and fuel could be accumulated in sufficient quantities to sustain military operations across islands and atolls and territories that had been captured from the Japanese at tremendous cost in American lives, and that still needed to be held against Japanese counterattacks, and that needed to serve as forward bases for the next phase of American military operations that would carry the war deeper into Japanese-held territory, toward the ultimate invasion of Japan itself. The problem was that aircraft required sophisticated infrastructure that did not exist on most of the islands and atolls of the Pacific where American forces were advancing. That elaborate concrete runways and taxiways and parking aprons and fuel storage facilities and ammunition magazines and repair hangars and barracks for maintenance personnel and sophisticated drainage systems and revetments to protect aircraft from bombing attacks required months of construction work using massive quantities of materials and specialized equipment and skilled workers and engineering expertise that were in limited supply and that needed to be allocated across multiple theaters of war where competing demands for resources and construction capacity meant that American military operations would be constrained not by the availability of combat forces, but by the availability of the infrastructure necessary to sustain those forces and provide them with the facilities they needed to conduct operations. The Japanese military had faced this same problem on an even more acute scale throughout their expansion across the Pacific in the years before American entry into the war and in the early years of the Pacific conflict, and the Japanese had responded by constructing elaborate airfields on territories they conquered, including on Guadalcanal and on numerous other islands and atolls where Japanese forces had established themselves. But the Japanese construction efforts had been hampered by lack of adequate equipment and by the need to transport construction materials across vast ocean distances, and by the reality that once American naval forces established dominance over key areas of the ocean, the Japanese could no longer bring in reinforcements and supplies and replacement equipment, and that the airfields they had constructed through enormous effort and at terrible cost in human life and resources would eventually be captured by American forces, or abandoned as Japanese forces were forced to retreat and relinquish territory that they had believed would be defended indefinitely, or until Japanese victory somehow emerged from strategic stalemate that seemed increasingly improbable as American military power accumulated across the Pacific. What American military planners recognized as the war progressed and as the pace of operations accelerated was that the traditional approach to airfield construction, which involved months of preparation, work, and the accumulation of massive quantities of materials and the importation of construction specialists from the United States, was not compatible with the speed at which American commanders needed to establish new forward bases and the frequency with which American forces were capturing new territory that needed to be immediately converted into operational airfields capable of supporting combat aircraft operations and forward-deployed maintenance personnel and logistical support functions that kept American military operations flowing toward the Japanese homeland at an accelerating pace that the Japanese military seemed increasingly unable to counter or resist despite the ferocity with which they fought on each island and despite their willingness to accept enormous casualties rather than surrender territory or retreat to more defensible positions that American military operations had already moved beyond before Japanese commanders could organize new defensive lines. The solution to this crisis in military logistics and military infrastructure emerged not from the imagination of military strategists or from elaborate planning processes conducted by senior commanders, but rather from the practical engineering. Problems that had been identified before the war even began, when American military planners and army engineers had recognized that modern warfare would require the ability to establish operating airfields on captured territory within days rather than months, and that the British military and the French military had already begun experimenting with various types of portable runway surfaces that could be transported by ship and assembled on previously unusable terrain, and that could be prepared for aircraft operations with a fraction of the time and effort that concrete runways required. And the American Military Research Establishment had seized upon this concept and had begun development of a standardized system of portable runway matting that would eventually become one of the most important technological innovations of the entire war, and that would fundamentally transform how military operations could be conducted across the vast distances of the Pacific, and that would make possible the rapid and relentless pace of American military operations during the final years of the Pacific War, the technology that would revolutionize military logistics and military operations in the Pacific, and that would allow American commanders to conduct military operations with a speed and flexibility that would ultimately overwhelm Japanese defensive efforts. Was based on a deceptively simple concept that had been developed by the United States Army Corps of Engineers at a research facility located in Mississippi called the Waterways Experiment Station, and that had been refined through a series of tests and experiments and modifications during 1940 and 1941 before the United States entered the war, and that consisted of nothing more complex than standardized sheets of perforated steel that could be punched with distinctive holes and that could be manufactured in large quantities using existing steel production facilities, and that could be transported across the ocean in the cargo holds of Liberty ships, and that could be assembled into runway surfaces by relatively unskilled workers following simple instructions, and that could be laid on almost any kind of terrain, regardless of whether the ground was solid or muddy or sandy or covered with coral or vegetation or other obstacles that would normally require extensive preparation work and grading and leveling before a runway surface could be constructed. The perforated steel planks that became known as Marston matting, because the material was first tested at Camp McCall Airfield, which was located adjacent to the town of Marston in North Carolina, were each 10 feet long and 15 inches wide, and approximately a quarter-inch thick, and weighed approximately 70 pounds, and consisted of sheets of low-carbon steel that had been stamped and pressed to create a series of U-shaped channels running lengthwise along the planks, and that had been perforated with 87 distinctive holes arranged in rows that served multiple functions, including reducing the weight of each individual plank, which made the material easier to transport and easier to handle and easier for construction workers to manipulate during the assembly process, improving traction for aircraft tires, which meant that aircraft could land on the matting with greater safety and could accelerate during takeoff with reduced risk of skidding or losing control, and permitting water to drain through the surface rather than accumulating on top of the runway, which was critical in tropical areas where rainfall was frequent and heavy and where standing water could quickly degrade runway surfaces and create unsafe landing conditions for aircraft. The edges of the Marston matting planks were fabricated with a series of hooks on one long edge and slots on the other long edge so that adjacent planks could be locked together simply by pushing one plank against another plank until the hooks engaged in the slots and created a continuous joined surface that was rigid enough to support the weight of heavy military aircraft, and that could be easily disassembled and moved to a new location if military operations required that the airfield be relocated, or if the strategic situation changed and American forces needed to abandon a position and establish a new airfield at a different location that would better serve the requirements of the ongoing military campaign. The entire system was designed with the understanding that it would need to be transportable across vast ocean distances and that it would need to be capable of being assembled by workers who had minimal training and experience, and that it would need to function reliably in tropical environments where salt water and intense heat and high humidity and intense sunlight could degrade materials that were not specifically designed to resist corrosion, and that the steel used in the manufacture of mast and matting was made with a high manganese content, specifically to resist corrosion and rust, and to maintain its structural integrity even after years of exposure to harsh tropical weather conditions that would have rapidly destroyed materials that did not have these protective characteristics. The production of mast and matting began in earnest after December 1941, when the Army Corps of Engineers issued the official design specification, and American manufacturers began setting up production lines dedicated to the manufacture of the perforated steel planks, and by the time of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, factories had already manufactured approximately 4 million square feet of the material, and within a year, the number of factories producing mast and matting had expanded to 29 separate facilities that were distributed across the American industrial base. And by 1944, when American military operations in the Pacific were accelerating and when demand for mast and matting was reaching its maximum, American manufacturers had produced more than 180 million square feet of the material, representing approximately 477,000 tons of steel that was enough to construct approximately 240 complete runways measuring 150 feet wide and 5,000 feet long. And that represented an enormous commitment of American industrial capacity and American steel production to the specific purpose of supporting military operations in the Pacific. The scale of the manufacturing effort required to produce the enormous quantities of mast and matting that American military operations required was staggering and represented in some sense a statement about American industrial confidence in ultimate victory in the Pacific War, an American willingness to invest massive resources in technologies that could accelerate military operations and that could give American commanders the flexibility and the speed of operations that would be necessary to overwhelm Japanese defensive efforts and to bring the war to an end before American military casualties accumulated to levels that would threaten American public support for the war effort, or that would require American political leadership to accept something less than unconditional Japanese surrender that would have left American commanders unable to accomplish their objectives of completely eliminating Japanese military capacity and Japanese willingness to continue fighting. The actual deployment and use of mast and matting on captured Pacific islands demonstrated that the theoretical concept that had been developed during pre-war planning exercises and that had been refined through testing and experimentation was actually capable of being translated into operational reality, and that American forces could indeed establish functional airfields on islands that had previously seemed unsuitable for airfield construction and that did not possess natural features that would make them attractive locations for elaborate permanent airfield construction, and that American military operations could therefore proceed at a pace that would have been impossible if commanders had been forced to wait for the construction of permanent concrete runways that would have required months of continuous work by large numbers of construction personnel equipped with heavy earth-moving equipment and steady supplies of concrete and asphalt and other construction materials. That would have been almost impossible to maintain on forward islands that were under periodic threat of Japanese air and naval attack. The logistics of deploying mast and matting to island locations were carefully choreographed, with the understanding that the speed at which an island could be converted from a newly captured position into an operational airfield would be limited by the availability of construction equipment and construction personnel and supplies of mast and matting, and also by the condition of the terrain on the island, and by the extent to which Japanese defensive efforts had destroyed existing infrastructure. That needed to be repaired before construction of the new airfield could begin, and military planners established procedures and protocols that would standardize the airfield construction process so that commanders at different locations would be able to replicate the most successful procedures that had been developed at early locations, and would not need to reinvent construction methodologies at each new location where American forces were attempting to establish operational airfields. The process of constructing an airfield from captured territory using mast and matting generally proceeded through several phases, beginning with the arrival of survey teams that would assess the available terrain and identify the most suitable location for the runway, that would need to be oriented into the prevailing wind direction, so that aircraft could take off and land with the wind at their backs, which would provide additional lift and would reduce the runway distance required for aircraft operations, followed by the deployment of heavy earth-moving equipment, including bulldozers and graders and rollers that would level the terrain and prepare a foundation for the matting that generally consisted of a base layer of crushed coral or crushed rock that would be compacted and rolled to create a stable foundation that would support the weight of the matting and the weight of heavy aircraft that would be operating from the runway. Following the preparation of the base layer, American construction workers and Navy Seabees would begin unloading mast and matting from cargo ships that had been specially positioned to offload materials onto the island and would begin assembling. The matting in long rows where hooks would be engaged in slots and where the matting would be locked together into a continuous surface that would eventually form the runway surface, and the Seabees would work continuously around the clock in many cases taking minimal breaks and working through tropical heat and humidity and torrential rainstorms that could sweep across Pacific islands seemingly without warning, and that could interrupt construction progress, but that could rarely stop the work completely, because the speed of construction was so critical to the overall requirements of American military operations, and because once construction had begun, there was extraordinary pressure to complete the work as rapidly as possible, so that aircraft could begin landing and bringing in supplies and ammunition and replacement personnel that were desperately needed by American forces operating on the newly captured islands. The remarkable achievement represented by the mast and matting system was not simply the construction of a runway surface, but rather the ability to compress what would normally have required weeks or months of construction work into a time frame of days, and in some remarkable cases, into a time frame of merely hours. And the historical documentation from American military operations indicates that trained Seabee construction teams working in coordinated fashion could construct a complete operational airfield measuring 5,000 feet long and 200 feet wide in approximately 2 days of continuous work, and that in some cases, teams of engineers working on particularly favorable terrain with adequate supplies of construction materials and adequate supplies of mast and matting could have an airfield ready to receive aircraft within 72 hours after the unloading of materials commenced, and that once aircraft began arriving at the airfield, the full scope of the engineering achievement became apparent because the runway surface was capable of supporting the weight of heavy military aircraft, including B-17 Flying Fortress bombers and B-29 Superfortress bombers and fighters and transports and reconnaissance aircraft and all of the various types of aircraft that American military operations required, and that damaged aircraft could be repaired at the airfield using temporary maintenance facilities, and that supplies and ammunition and fuel could be accumulated in sufficient quantities to sustain ongoing military operations in support of ground forces and in support of naval operations, and in support of the overall American strategy of gradually advancing across the Pacific toward the Japanese homeland. And the speed at which American military operations could be accelerated through the use of mast and matting meant that American commanders could maintain constant pressure on Japanese forces and could prevent Japanese military leadership from establishing defensive lines and stabilizing defensive positions, because American forces were advancing so rapidly that Japanese commanders were constantly struggling to keep pace with the speed of American military operations and were constantly finding themselves outflanked and surrounded and forced to retreat as American forces captured new territory with a regularity and speed that eventually became overwhelming and that contributed significantly to the Japanese military's inability to mount effective defensive responses despite the willingness of Japanese soldiers to fight to the death and despite the commitment of Japanese military resources to the defense of territory that seemed inevitably destined to be captured by advancing American forces. The logistics network that made possible the rapid deployment of mast and matting to Pacific Islands and the accelerated construction of operational airfields represented one of the most complex and carefully coordinated supply chain operations in the entire history of warfare, involving the coordination of multiple branches of the American military, including the Army Corps of Engineers and the Navy Seabees and the Army Transportation Corps and the Army Signal Corps, and countless other specialized units that had to work in harmony, despite sometimes competing priorities, and sometimes conflicting requirements, and sometimes inadequate supplies of critical materials and equipment that were also desperately needed in other theaters of war, where American military operations were simultaneously unfolding on an even larger scale in Europe, where American forces were engaged in the invasion of Normandy and the subsequent liberation of occupied Europe from Nazi domination. The process of delivering mast and matting to island locations began with identification of the specific requirements at each location, including the length and width of runways needed and the quantity of matting required and the timing of when. The matting would need to arrive at the island so that construction could begin immediately upon completion of preliminary site preparation, and so that construction work would not be delayed by lack of materials or by the arrival of matting at times when construction crews were not ready to begin assembly work, or when tactical situations on the island made it impossible for construction work to proceed safely without placing American construction workers at unacceptable risk from Japanese defensive efforts that had not yet been completely suppressed, or from Japanese air attacks that still threatened American positions during the months following initial island capture, when Japanese forces maintained the capacity to mount aerial counterattacks despite the general American dominance of the air, and despite the continuous American efforts to suppress Japanese air capabilities through combat operations and through bombing campaigns directed against Japanese airfields and aircraft production facilities. The mast and matting that was produced by American factories was packaged into standardized units that could be loaded onto Liberty ships and other cargo vessels that were allocated to the Pacific Theater, and that would make the long voyage across the Pacific, carrying not just mast and matting, but also fuel and ammunition and replacement personnel, and food and medical supplies, and countless other items that American military operations required in order to maintain continuous pressure on Japanese forces, and in order to support the advancing front lines, where American ground forces were locked in combat with Japanese defenders who were fighting with a desperation and a commitment to death before surrender that made every island capture a costly undertaking that consumed lives and consumed resources, and consumed the patience and the psychological endurance of American soldiers who understood that the war showed no signs of ending despite the accumulated Japanese defeats, and despite the advance of American forces closer and closer toward Japan itself. The coordination of shipping schedules, and the coordination of construction schedules, and the coordination of tactical operations all had to occur in such a way that mast and matting would arrive at captured islands at precisely the right moment, so that construction work could proceed without delay, and so that operational airfields would be ready to receive aircraft at the exact moment when those aircraft were needed to support the next phase of military operations, or to defend against Japanese counterattacks, or to conduct bombing operations against Japanese installations and Japanese supply lines that the American military was systematically severing through relentless bombing campaigns and through naval blockade operations that were gradually strangling Japanese military capacity and Japanese ability to sustain military forces throughout the vast territories that Japanese armies occupied across Asia and across the Pacific regions that Japan had conquered during the years of Japanese military expansion before and during the early years of the Pacific War. The supply lines that kept American military operations functioning represented an achievement of logistics that matched or perhaps exceeded the supply line achievements that supported the Allied operations in Europe, with hundreds of cargo ships shuttling back and forth across the Pacific, carrying supplies and equipment and replacement personnel and ammunition and fuel in quantities that seemed almost incomprehensible in their magnitude, and that required the coordination of civilian shipbuilding capacity and civilian cargo handling capacity and civilian transportation infrastructure that had been conscripted into military service for the duration of the war, and that often operated on margins so thin that delays in any single component of the supply chain could result in shortages of critical materials at forward positions that could disrupt military operations and could place American military units at risk and could undermine the carefully constructed plans of American military leadership for the pace and the scale and the timing of military operations against Japanese forces. The actual deployment of mast and matting on specific Pacific islands documented remarkable achievements in speed and efficiency that exceeded even the optimistic expectations that had been established during the pre-war planning phases, and that demonstrated the capacity of American military personnel and American engineering expertise to accomplish extraordinary feats of construction under conditions that ranged from extremely difficult to almost impossible, including conditions where Japanese forces were still defending the territory, and where construction work had to be conducted under fire or under threat of air attack, and where supply lines stretched so thin that construction materials sometimes ran short, and where weather conditions threatened to destroy completed work, and where disease and injury and combat casualties thinned the ranks of construction workers to the point that American commanders sometimes had to halt construction work temporarily until replacement personnel could arrive to bring construction crews back up to the minimum levels necessary to continue work at an acceptable pace. On Eniwetok Atoll in the Marshall Islands, American Seabees working under conditions of extreme difficulty with Japanese forces still present and still fighting constructed multiple operational airfields using mast and matting that allowed American combat aircraft to begin operating within days of the atoll's capture. And that enabled American forces to support subsequent amphibious operations against other islands and atolls, and that allowed American bombers to begin missions against Japanese installations throughout the region, with a speed that would have been impossible if American forces had been forced to wait for the construction of permanent concrete runways that would have required months of construction work, and that would have required bringing massive quantities of concrete and asphalt across the ocean from the United States, through supply lines that were already heavily burdened with the requirements of supporting American military operations across multiple theaters of war. On Saipan in the Mariana Islands, American engineers and Seabees constructed airfields that would eventually serve as forward bases for the Boeing B-29 Superfortress strategic bombing campaign against Japan itself, and the speed with which these airfields were constructed after Saipan's capture in June 1944 was so rapid that within 3 months, B-29 bombers were beginning operations from Saipan, launching bombing missions against Japanese targets across a vast region of Japanese-occupied territory, and eventually conducting bombing raids directly against the Japanese homeland that would result in the destruction of Japanese cities and Japanese military installations on an unprecedented scale that demonstrated that American forces had achieved air superiority so complete and so overwhelming that Japanese defensive efforts were almost powerless to prevent American bombing campaigns from proceeding at whatever pace American military leadership determined was necessary to accomplish the objective of systematically destroying Japanese military capacity and Japanese industrial capacity and Japanese ability to wage war through the relentless application of American air power that had become possible only because American forces had developed the ability to establish operational airfields at a rate and at a pace that allowed American bombers and American fighters to operate from forward bases that brought them progressively closer to the Japanese homeland, and that allowed American air commanders to mass enormous quantities of aircraft at locations where those aircraft could be used to maximum effect in support of American military strategy of gradually strangling Japanese military capacity through a combination of bombing campaigns and naval blockade and island-hopping operations that were gradually bringing American forces closer to Japan itself. The Japanese military leadership recognized with increasing clarity that American forces had developed operational capabilities that the Japanese military could not match or counter effectively, and that American logistical capabilities were producing an abundance of military resources that seemed almost infinite from the Japanese perspective, which was shaped by the experience of operating under conditions of increasing scarcity and increasing difficulty in obtaining materials and supplies necessary to maintain military operations across the vast territories that Japanese armies occupied, and that Japanese military leadership was desperately trying to hold against American forces whose advance seemed relentless and whose commitment to continued military operations seemed unshakable. despite Japanese hopes that American public opinion might eventually tire of the war and that American political leadership might eventually be persuaded to accept something less than unconditional. Japanese surrender that would have allowed Japan to retain some portion of the territories it had conquered, and that would have allowed Japanese military forces to maintain some semblance of fighting capacity rather than experiencing the total annihilation of military power and the complete subjugation of national territory that seemed to be the inevitable result of American determination to continue military operations until Japan surrendered unconditionally and until American forces occupied Japan itself, and until American military and political leadership had the opportunity to restructure Japanese society and Japanese government and Japanese military institutions in ways that would serve American strategic interests in the post-war period, and that would ensure that Japan could never again threaten American security or American interests in the Pacific region. The strategic implications of American ability to construct operational airfields in a matter of days, rather than weeks or months, were profound and far-reaching, and affected not just the tactical pace of military operations, but the entire strategic orientation of American military planning and American military operations throughout the Pacific theater, and shaped the way American military leadership thought about the possibilities for moving forward with military campaigns that relied on the capture of successive island positions that would serve as forward bases for the next phase of military operations, and that would gradually bring American forces closer to the Japanese homeland, and that would eventually lead to the invasion of Japan itself, and the final destruction of Japanese military power, and the complete occupation of Japanese territory, and the establishment of American military authority over the Japanese nation for whatever period American political leadership determined was necessary to accomplish the objectives of American post-war policy regarding Japan, and regarding the restructuring of the international order in Asia and in the Pacific regions. American military commanders understood that the pace of operations was fundamentally constrained by logistical capabilities and by infrastructure capabilities, and by the speed at which new territory could be captured and converted into forward bases that would serve as springboards for the next phase of military operations, and the development of mast and matting, and the rapid construction techniques that Seabees had developed using mast and matting fundamentally altered the equation regarding how quickly American forces could advance, and regarding how many simultaneous operations American military command could support, and regarding the overall tempo of military operations that American forces could maintain while still providing adequate supplies and ammunition and fuel to sustaining forces at the front lines, and still maintaining the discipline and the order and the coordination of military operations that separated effective military operations from chaos and collapse. The Japanese military, by contrast, was operating under conditions of increasing scarcity and increasing difficulty in sustaining military forces across vast territories, and was increasingly unable to mount effective counteroffensives or to establish defensive lines that could resist sustained American military pressure, and was forced to watch as American forces advanced with a regularity and a predictability that suggested that Japanese defensive efforts were becoming increasingly ineffective and increasingly unable to alter the trajectory of the war, despite the willingness of Japanese soldiers to fight to the death, and despite the commitment of Japanese military resources to the defense of specific islands and specific regions that seemed strategically significant, but that proved almost invariably to be outflanked and surrounded and rendered irrelevant by the speed and the scale and the coordination of American military operations that seemed to accomplish in weeks what Japanese planners had imagined would require months or years. The contrast between American military capabilities and Japanese military capabilities became increasingly stark and increasingly visible to Japanese military leadership as the war progressed, and as American forces demonstrated through their actions and through their operational achievements that they possessed technological capabilities and logistical capabilities and industrial capabilities that seemed to put American military power in a fundamentally different category from Japanese military power. And that suggested that the outcome of the war was not merely uncertain, but was instead almost inevitable, given the vast gulf between American capabilities and Japanese capabilities, and given the apparent American commitment to continued military operations regardless of how many years it might require to ultimately force Japanese surrender, through total military defeat and through the destruction of Japanese military power and through the complete occupation of Japanese territory. The human cost of the rapid construction techniques and the accelerated pace of military operations that American development of mast and matting and related technologies had made possible was substantial and is often overlooked in historical accounts that focus on the technological achievements and the logistical successes of American military operations without adequately acknowledging the toll in American lives and in Japanese lives and in civilian lives that was paid as a result of the acceleration of military operations and the shortening of timescales for military campaigns that might otherwise have proceeded at a slower pace had American forces been dependent on more traditional methods of airfield construction and military-based development that would have required more extensive preparation work and more substantial investment of time and resources, and that would have limited the pace at which American forces could advance and the pace at which American forces could maintain continuous pressure on Japanese defensive positions, and the pace at which American forces could conduct bombing operations against Japanese installations and Japanese military units and Japanese civilian populations throughout Japanese-occupied territories. The speed with which American military operations could proceed in the Pacific theater as a result of American technological innovations and logistical achievements was purchased in part through the accelerated exposure of American military personnel and American construction workers to combat conditions and to Japanese defensive efforts and to disease and to the physical hardships and the psychological strain of operating continuously under conditions of extreme difficulty and extreme stress, and often with inadequate rest and inadequate nutrition and inadequate medical care, and with the knowledge that Japanese forces were continuing to resist and continuing to fight with a desperation that made every island capture and every airfield construction operation a hazardous undertaking that placed American lives at risk and that resulted in American casualties that accumulated day by day and week by week and month by month as American military operations continued their relentless advance toward the Japanese homeland. The Japanese military and the Japanese civilian population paid an even heavier toll as American forces advanced and as American bombing campaigns intensified and as American control of airspace and sea space became more complete and as American forces pressed closer and closer to the Japanese homeland and as Japanese military leadership desperately attempted to mount defensive operations that could resist American military pressure, but that proved increasingly ineffective and increasingly suicidal as American military power grew stronger and more concentrated and more focused on the objective of bringing the war to an end through total military victory and through the complete destruction of Japanese military capacity and through the establishment of American military occupation of the Japanese homeland that seemed increasingly inevitable as American military operations proceeded with accelerating tempo and with mounting success in achieving American military objectives across the Pacific theater. The decision by American military leadership to invest massive resources in the development and production and deployment of technologies like mast and matting that would accelerate the pace of military operations represented a conscious choice to prioritize the rapid conclusion of the war over the conservation of American military manpower and resources, and represented a judgment that the faster the war could be concluded, the better the outcome would be for American interests and for the interests of nations allied with the United States, and that any resources that could be invested in accelerating military operations represented worthwhile expenditures, even if those resources might have been used for other purposes had American military leadership determined that a slower pace of military operations would be preferable, or had American political leadership determined that resources should be diverted to other uses or to other theaters of war, where competing strategic interests and competing military requirements were generating conflicting demands for limited quantities of resources and limited quantities of military equipment and limited quantities of construction materials and limited quantities of skilled Military personnel who could be assigned to military operations in specific locations. The legacy of American development of portable airfield construction technology, and the legacy of American Seabees and American military engineers who mastered the techniques of rapid airfield construction using mast and matting, extended far beyond the conclusion of the Pacific War and influenced the entire post-war development of American military capabilities and American military infrastructure and American military logistics and American military doctrine regarding the importance of the ability to establish forward operating bases rapidly and to maintain the momentum of military operations and to sustain continuous pressure against enemy forces regardless of geography or terrain or environmental conditions that might seem to preclude the establishment of military facilities through conventional construction methods. American military planners and American political leadership recognized after the conclusion of the war that American military capabilities in the post-war period would need to include the capacity to deploy military forces rapidly to threatened regions and to establish forward military bases and to sustain military operations in remote locations and in hostile environments, and that technologies developed during the Pacific War and operational techniques refined through the experience of rapid airfield construction could be adapted and refined and extended to serve purposes in the post-war world that American military leadership anticipated would be characterized by tensions between the Soviet Union and the Western powers, and that would require American military to maintain forward operating bases and forward deployed military forces at numerous locations around the world to deter Soviet military aggression and to respond rapidly to threats to American interests and to American allies, and to maintain American military presence in regions where American political leadership determined that American interests were at stake. The techniques developed by American Seabees during the Pacific War for rapid construction of military facilities became incorporated into American military doctrine and American military planning and American military logistics in ways that persisted throughout the Cold War and that continue to influence American military operations in the contemporary period, with military engineers and military construction personnel continuing to emphasize speed and flexibility and adaptability in the establishment of forward operating bases and forward military facilities, in locations where American military forces might need to conduct operations or where American military forces might need to establish presence to support American allies or to deter hostile military powers from pursuing actions that American political and military leadership determined would be contrary to American interests. The mast and matting system itself continued to be manufactured and continued to be stockpiled and continued to be deployed at various locations throughout the post-war period and continues to be used in contemporary military operations around the world where American military forces, or forces of American allies, require rapid establishment of operational airfields or operational military facilities in locations where traditional construction methods would require extensive preparation, work and extensive expenditure of time and resources, and where the speed of establishing operational capability represents a critical factor in determining whether American military forces and American allies can respond effectively to military threats and can maintain effective military operations in support of American strategic interests and in support of the interests of nations allied with the United States. The story of how America built floating airfields in the Pacific in just 3 days represents ultimately a story about the application of American technological innovation and American industrial capacity and American military expertise and American logistical capabilities to the solution of practical problems of military operations, and represents a story about how military leaders who understood the requirements of modern warfare and who recognized the constraints that infrastructure and logistics could place on military operations made investments in technological development and in manufacturing capacity and in training and in doctrinal development that produced military capabilities that allowed American forces to conduct military operations with a speed and efficiency and effectiveness that ultimately contributed to American military victory in the Pacific War, and that contributed to the establishment of American military superiority and American strategic dominance in the post-war world, and that demonstrated that American commitment to the investment in military technology and military logistics and military infrastructure, represented one of the foundations of American military power and American ability to project power across vast distances, and American ability to maintain forward military presence, and American ability to respond to military threats and security challenges in a manner that reflected American technological sophistication and American industrial capacity, and American military professionalism, and American understanding of what military operations would require in the modern world and in the contemporary period, where distance and time and terrain and environmental conditions no longer represent insurmountable obstacles to the establishment of military facilities and military operations, but instead represent challenges that American military personnel and American military engineers and American military logisticians understand how to overcome through the application of technology and training and careful planning and coordination of complex operations involving thousands of personnel working in harmony to accomplish military objectives and to project American military power and American military presence to locations around the world, where American political and military leadership determines that American interests are at stake and where American military forces need to establish operational capability to support American strategic interests and to support the interests of nations allied with the United States, and to maintain the military superiority and the strategic dominance that has characterized American military power throughout the post-war period, and that continues to characterize American military capabilities in the contemporary international security environment, where competition between great powers and competition between different visions of international order and different approaches to regional security continue to shape military planning and military operations and military doctrine throughout the world.